Elizabeth I inherited from her father a country that had made no provision for the poor. It's estimated about 150,000 people in need were tipped out onto the streets. So when Elizabeth took the throne, she had a really quite a big sort of societal problem. Anytime you're trying to do restoration to a 700-year-old building, you're going to come across things that you did not expect.
Welcome, everybody. Today I'm talking to Heidi Meyer from Lord Leycester Hospital. She's the master there, and we're going to be talking about the history of this incredibly significant complex of buildings. So Heidi, welcome, and could you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about your role?
Yes, as you said, I'm the master of the Lord Leycester Hospital, which is a medieval site that was built in the late 1300s and early 1400s. And as master, there have been masters at the Lord Leycester ever since that time. The first masters were the master of the guilds of Warwick, who lived on this site. And then in the Tudor period, it switched hands and became the Lord Leycester Hospital, which is a philanthropic organisation. And then the masters of that organisation have lived here on site. So I'm in fact the 33rd master of the Lord Leycester Hospital.
And the first female one, I believe.
And the first female, yeah. So there are 33 masters of the Lord Leycester, and they have all lived here and worked here and kept this site going since the founding date of 1571.
Amazing. So what's involved in the day-to-day running of the site?
So it's first of all, it's a charity, a little bit like the Royal Hospital Chelsea, but it's older. It's about 100 years older than the Royal Hospital Chelsea. I think lots of people are familiar with the Chelsea pensioner in his red coat and hat walking through London. So we're created and founded on the same principles as that, but we were 100 years older than the Royal Hospital, and we are much smaller. But we are part of that tradition of hospitals that were created in the Tudor period. And they are not hospitals as we know them today, medical institutions, but hospitals that actually were philanthropic organizations that looked after the deserving poor of society and the community.
And there are still what are called brethren living with you today?
Yep. So the brethren were the original recipients of the charity in 1571. It was set up for 12 brethren. And they were deserving poor, mostly soldiers who had fought in the Elizabethan Wars. And they were given a place at the Lord Leycester and a stipend, an annual stipend. So in the Tudor period, that was a pretty big deal, actually. I mean, you were set for life if you were given that. But the brethren were the original residents in 1571, and we've had brethren living here ever since. So they have a 450-year legacy, which is pretty amazing.
That's incredible. Well, maybe we should mention here the reason it's named since 1571 the Lord Leycester Hospital, and that of course is Robert Dudley, who of course was everyone knows as one of the favourites of Elizabeth I, but of course he was a commander in her army. So was this a particular thing that he wanted to do because he'd been leading soldiers and saw the impact on them, do you think?
Well, yeah, certainly that's part of it, but it's a bit more, like most of the things in the Tudor period, it's a bit more political than that.
Okay.
I mean, certainly Elizabeth I inherited from her father a country that had made no provision for the poor. Henry VIII and the Reformation stopped the work of all the monasteries that traditionally had looked after the poor. And it meant that the poor of England, and it's estimated about 150,000 people in need were tipped out onto the streets. So when Elizabeth took the throne, she had a really quite a big sort of societal problem is, what do you do with so many poor on the streets? And there were beggars and they were mugging people. It was really quite a big problem. And Lord Burleigh said to her, "Ma'am, you've got to do something about this problem." So she did. And she passed a series of poor laws. And these poor laws asked that every parish set up a hospital, and that the parishes would put money and tithes towards these hospitals, and they would be set up to look after the deserving poor and to sort of clean up the streets, which was in everyone's interest. And so hospitals were set up in the Tudor period, and you begin to see them sort of springing up all over England. And there are definitely quite a number that still exist throughout the United Kingdom and England particularly. Now, going back to your point about Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, he was indeed a favourite of Elizabeth I. In fact, he was probably the man that came closest to marrying her. So you can imagine he's in the court in London. There's lots of talk about the poor laws and these philanthropic hospitals. And he thinks, well, goodness me, what can I do to please the one I love? I too can set up a hospital. And indeed, that's what he did. He lived nearby in Kenilworth in a big castle. And he made a decision that he was going to set up his own hospital near to Kenilworth, came riding by in Warwick, saw these incredible medieval buildings that were the guild buildings then, and said, aha, I would like to have those buildings, and that's where I'll set up my hospital. And so, because he was a man of great influence, the burgesses of Warwick passed the buildings of the Lord Leicester, or the guild buildings as they were then, onto him. And in 1571, he founded the Lord Leycester Hospital. And we still exist today as the Lord Leycester Hospital.
Right. So he picks out these buildings that have already got a purpose, have already been there for what, 250, 300 years by this point. So how did they function? This is a large time period, so or maybe you can explain how they functioned or how they developed from the time that the site sort of began up until it became Lord Leycester Hospital.
Well, let's go back to the very, very beginning in the late 1300s, when the guilds, the United Guilds of Warwick, built these buildings. And they built them over a period of about 30 years, which is quite remarkable in the medieval period, that you could put up a site like this, which is quite a substantive site for the medieval period. You could put it up in such a short period of time, a period of about 30 or 40 years. It says that guilds must have had really quite a lot of money and quite a lot of influence to be able to put up such buildings. The buildings themselves have not changed. We have exactly the same buildings as we did from the late 1300s. The only thing that's really changed is their purpose. So in the period of the guilds, they were used as for banqueting, for the guild's meetings, for looking after the poor. The Great Hall was used for hospitality. Guild Hall was used for the guild's meetings. And so when Robert Dudley came along in 1571 to found the Lord Leycester Hospital, he didn't really need to change any of the buildings. He didn't add on any buildings. He didn't make any great changes because the space was already there. He just simply changed the purpose of the guilds running it to it now becoming a philanthropic organization for wounded warriors and deserving poor, known as the Lord Leycester Hospital. So its charter changed, but the buildings themselves really have not changed since that time.
That's incredible. So I'm presuming it takes a lot of upkeep and expense. And we'll come back to that, because obviously at the moment you're closed to the public because you've got a major program of restoration going on. But one of the things I noticed when I walked past the other week when I was in Warwick is Warwick's clearly an old town, you can tell, but a lot of the buildings, Lord Leycester Hospital still stands out. You get to it and you're like, goodness me, there's a Tudor building. What have I been looking at down this street? And they're sort of Georgian, I suppose, I think, down the rest of the street. Why is that? Why are you sort of stood on your own as a Tudor building in Warwick?
I think that, one has to remember the Great Fire of Warwick in 1694. So up until 1694, pretty much all of Warwick would have looked like the buildings of the Lord Leycester Hospital. Perhaps not as grand, probably much smaller cottages. And Lord Leycester, as the guild buildings, would have definitely dominated the high street. But all the buildings would have been these half-timbered, medieval-looking buildings. And then the Great Fire of Warwick happened in 1694. And they started on the other side of the road to the Lord Leycester Hospital. And because the wind was sweeping in the direction away from the Lord Leycester, it took the Great Fire all the way down the high street and burnt all of the medieval buildings, leaving the Lord Leycester standing. And so from 1694, all the buildings in the high street, and most of Warwick, in fact, are post-1694 buildings, and we stand out as a fine, extraordinary medieval site that was able to survive that fire.
You do. It's really noticeable when you walk down the road. So, Great Fire of Warwick. I imagine a lot of people won't have heard of that. There's also a chapel on the site, is it? Because you notice the buildings, the sort of half timber frame buildings, and a chapel and a gate. So, do you want to explain the sort of the location of the hospital?
Yeah. So let's go all the way back to even before the let's just say just after the Norman conquest in Britain in 1066. I think everybody is familiar with that. The Norman conquest changed the fabric of Britain, and one of the things that the Normans did was to begin to fortify towns. So the wall, we think that the wall of Warwick, the wall that surrounds Warwick, the medieval wall, was built in just after 1066. And it protected the town, and there were gates, 3 gates that were put into that wall for entry into the town: the East Gate, West Gate, and the North Gate. To this day, we still have the East Gate and the West Gate. And the 66, when the wall was built, to 1300s, the early 1300s. It was there was a decision made that a chapel should be built on top of the West Gate. There probably had been a chapel there before, but a chapel was built over the West Gate by Thomas Beecham, and it was designed really so that if you were leaving Warwick and you were going through the West Gate, that you could stop off at this chapel and you could say prayers for your safe journey, because once you left the walls of Warwick and you went out into the wilds on your way to Stratford, anything could happen to you. So people would often make prayers for safe travel before they left the protection of the city, and the chapel was there to do that. It was also a chantry chapel, so it had its role, it had a very important role, and it's that same chapel that sits atop the West Gate now today, and which is part of the Lord Leycester Hospital.
It seems quite an eclectic mix of buildings. I mean, I know they're sort of built over quite a short period of time, but so is that because of the different purposes of each? It's sort of got an overall purpose, but each particular section has got a singular purpose. I'm thinking about the guilds and how they would have used the site.
Well, in fact, it's actually pretty homogeneous, actually, in the sense you've got the chapel that was built early on the wall. But then very shortly afterwards, you have the rest of the medieval buildings that were built around the chapel by the guilds. And so it's actually quite, if all of the buildings built by the guilds had a purpose. So they built the guild hall, a bit like their corporate meeting room for their meetings, the guild hall. The Great Hall was built for hospitality, for their banquets, but also looking after travellers that came in through the West Gate and needed a place to stay the night, didn't have hotels. So they could stay in the Great Hall and get food and a bed for the night. probably a pile of straw actually rather than a bed.
Mhm.
And then you had the master's house, and then you probably had a few storage and outbuildings around the site. Buildings were built originally with very specific purposes, and they were all built in the same style, built around a medieval courtyard. We call it domestic medieval architecture, with an entrance into that courtyard. So really, there are two distinct periods when they built. The early, probably originally the chapel that was there, built in the 1100s, shortly after the Norman period, the chapel by Thomas Beecham in the 1300s, and then in the late 1300s, all the rest of the medieval buildings.
So you're looking now forward to the summer, because let's talk about the renovation, which has you closed to the public at the moment, which people can follow via your newsletter and Instagram, which I've been doing. Do you want to give us a bit of background as to why the restoration is, why you're doing the restoration, and then let's get on to some of the finds, because I'm really desperate to ask you about some of the things you found while you're doing it as well.
So, well, you can imagine that buildings that were built in the 14th century, they need quite a lot of TLC. I mean, you really do have to look after them. You can't go years and years without maintaining them. And it became quite apparent about 5 years ago that our buildings needed a lot of care and a lot of restoration. And not only that, bits of the wattle and daub were falling out, the guttering was not good, the pipes weren't good, the electrics weren't good. And the last big restoration was in the 1950s. So it was definitely time for a sort of once in a century upgrade and restoration. But not only that, it wasn't just about repairing the buildings and looking after them. We also wanted to improve the visitor experience. We wanted to make sure that when visitors came to look at our medieval site, one of the most important in Britain, to be fair, that they also had a good experience. They had a nice visitor centre, a nice cafe, that there were museum exhibits that were warm and well displayed. So our project is not just about restoration of the site, it's also about really improving the experience for a heritage visitor. So it's really a two-part project. And that's why it's taken us quite a long time to do it, because it's not just simply doing building works to restore the wattle and daub. We're actually changing the whole look and feel of the inside of the place to upgrade it to modern times.
This is going to be good. Now, you've come across some things that you knew were there, I think, from what I read. There's a couple of other little things. I think I saw a cupboard on on the Instagram post that was something that hadn't been seen for quite a while. I know it's a cupboard, but you think it's a cupboard, someone built that cupboard, what were they using the cupboard for? I love little things like that. But you've also got the commemorative seal, which commemorated the visit of James I, which has been covered up, I believe, for was Victorian sealing, I think, got put. Do you want to tell people about that?
Yeah, so it's always fun when you're doing a restoration of a building like this to find out the secrets that lie within the walls and the floorboards. And we have found a couple, some that we knew were there, but some that are surprises. Don't forget that there was a restoration in the 1950s. So really old finds were probably found in the 1950s. But even so, that said, let me run through a couple of the fun things that we found. As you said, we have uncovered the seal, and the seal was put up in the Great Hall to commemorate the visit of James I to the banqueting hall of the Lord Leycester in 1617. James I came to dinner here because the castle, he would have gone to the castle, he would have gone to the home of the noble in Warwick, but he couldn't because the castle had burned down and it was going under, it was being rebuilt. So instead, he came to the banqueting hall, the Great Hall of the Lord Leycester. It was, by all accounts, it was an amazing feast. It cost the town, I think they were in debt for about 10 years to pay for the feast. But they did, nevertheless, put up a seal. We're not exactly sure when they put it up, but they put it up on the wall of the Great Hall to commemorate that very, very important event of James I's banqueting in the Great Hall. I have no idea why, but for some reason, in the past, and it's likely it was in the 1950s restoration, a decision was made to cover up the seal. And ever since, the last, 70 or 80 years, we've known that the seal has been hidden behind a wall. And so we've been very excited about the moment that we would uncover it and see the seal. And that happened a couple of weeks ago. And it's there, and we will keep it uncovered for everyone to see. We'll spruce it up a little bit, clean it up a little bit, put some nice lights on it. But it's really exciting, and it's as my architect says, it's a contradictory bit of history, because you've got the ancient seal, and then you've got the 1950s timbers and roof areas that we've uncovered, and you can see the two side by side. So it's a lot of fun. It's a lot bigger than we thought. It's actually about 7 foot high, and so a lot bigger. I mean, you'd think a seal might be a couple of feet across, but it's really quite a big piece of work, and it dominates the Great Hall. So that's one of the things the public will be able to see when they visit us when we reopen in the summer next year. Oh,
I bet you were itching to get hold of that to see that. I bet that.
Yeah, and we had actually run with our Court Leet here in Warwick. We'd actually run a couple of fundraising events to raise the money to reveal the seal. So it was a Warwick community event as well. So they're very happy about seeing that as well. So what are the other little things we found? Well, one of the things that I personally love is the builders were in the Brethren's kitchen the other day, which has been a kitchen ever since the guilds, the time of the guilds, but then also from 1571 when the Lord Leycester was founded. And it's where the cook has cooked the food for the Lord Leycester, for the community. And, cooks have rules. There are rules in the kitchen. And our cook, apparently, in the mid-1850s, had some very strict rules. And they were written up and they were put in the wall. And there were things like rule number 7 was the brethren and their wives will not bring their slops into the kitchen and put them down the sink in the kitchen. The cook will be allowed to peacefully cook dinner in time for 1 o'clock and should not be disturbed until that time. So there are all these very cute little rules that come out of the mid-1800s, and the builders literally uncovered the cook's rules written on a piece of wooden board in a wall. They pulled the plasterboard down, and there were the cook's rules that had been hidden probably for 70 or 80 years. So since the time of the 1950s. So that's my personal favourite. The other little things, as we pull up the floorboards, we find lots of fun things in floorboards. We find old pipes, old cigarette packages, matches, photographs of people who've hidden them in the floorboards, and notes that people have hidden in the floorboards. And so together you begin to create this lovely social history about bygone times here at the Lord Leycester.
There must be quite an energy there. I'm just thinking of it's been constantly occupied. You never had a time of it not being. All those humans who've lived and met and worked and stayed in the hospital. That's quite a lot of human history in one place.
Yeah, well, it's been inhabited since the late 1300s, well, probably before the 1300s, actually. So you've got a community that's an unbroken story of community for almost 700 years. So it's quite a story, actually, a completely unbroken legacy of community and philanthropic living in one place. that really is quite a story. Of course, I always get when you say there's quite I think you said there's a good spirit there, or
Energy, yeah.
Energy. People always ask me the question about, I get the inevitable question about ghosts at the Lord Leycester, because they know how old it is and they know that people have lived there. And I do get questions about ghosts. There are a couple of reports of a monk in a cowl that lives in the Great Hall. So we've got that story. We've got the story of the gardener in the garden, who is seen from time to time gardening in Victorian clothes. So there are stories. Generally speaking, there's a really good energy, though. Even if we do have ghosts, I'm sure they're all benign, and they're all good ghosts. They're not bad ghosts.
They had nice times at the hospital, so we're not dealing with any problematic spirits.
No.
Now, you've mentioned the kitchen a couple of times, and this always intrigues me. After I visited a priory in Salzburg, and you can still visit the hall there and eat as they have done, obviously without the Reformation, without the dissolution of their monasteries. And it's amazing. It's I thought, oh, well, there's nowhere in England where we can do that, because all the monasteries went. This place where there's been this continual hospitality for travellers. But of course, you are then one of these places. So once the cafe reopens on site, that's the thing that's being brought back. I love that idea.
Yeah, well, it's, we tell a great story. We're one of the most important medieval sites in Britain. We've got this 700-year legacy of community living in the same place. We're a central part of Warwick, one of the great stories about Warwick. And it's really quite a unique community. So we definitely have a story to tell, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to spend time on our historical interpretation and upgrading the visitor experience. And it's not just the buildings, of course, either. We have our gardens, 500-year-old gardens, and they're as much part of the site as the buildings. And together, the gardens and the buildings tell the story of community living, where you grow your produce in the garden, you bring it into the kitchen, you cook it, everybody sits there communally and eats, whether it was in the guild period of the guilds or whether it was the Lord Leycester. So you've got this sort of harmonious living in one communal site. So, and then you've got stories of all the individuals that lived here. We've got lots of stories that we've been able to uncover about the soldiers who lived here, soldiers that came from war in India, Battle of Waterloo, the Charge of the Light Brigade, and they all fought for their country, and then they came back to live in their later years peacefully at the Lord Leycester. And they have these wonderful stories about exciting lives, and then they bring with them their medals, their swords, the weapons they used, and they bring with them tales of exciting living and fighting for your country overseas. And you can imagine them all sitting around the fire in the Brethren's kitchen, relating the stories of bygone years. So that's a big part of our historical narrative as well.
And do you have a great archive? I'm imagining a fantastic archive that you have access to.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. We've got archives and artifacts, and a lot of them come from the 1500s. They're not much earlier than the 1500s. So what we see from 1571, when we were founded by Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, we see a lot of official documents, and they're amazing Tudor documents, massive documents with big wax seals and glamorous writing. And they are the Acts of Parliament that created this place, the statutes and rules by which the residents here would live by. So we have these wonderful Tudor documents. And then ever since the 1500s, you have this record, letters, accounts, new Acts of Parliament for the Lord Leicester. So you have a pretty good record and sense of what life was like. You even have the Master's book, where all the masters from the 1600s have written entries of the most important events. So a bit like a journal that spans 400 years. So yeah, we absolutely have got this historical narrative that gives us really good insights to the way life was, how people led their life here in this community, but not, unfortunately, pre-1500s. So that's the one period we don't know very much about. We really don't know what the guilds did here at the Lord Leicester. They weren't called the Lord Leicester then, of course, they were the guild buildings. But we really don't have much information about what they did here and what happened on a day-to-day basis. And that is the great area of research that could be undertaken in the future.
So we spoke about the buildings, a little bit about the gardens. What kind of artifacts have you got? I've seen a picture of an inkwell, which was quite intriguing, with a padlock on it, which I've never seen anywhere else. What other sorts of things will people be able to see when they're able to visit again?
Well, things like the chair that was built for James I when he came to the banquet here in 1617. A special chair was made for him, and it was an extra wide chair, because the story goes that James I wore lots of padding because he was worried about bomb attacks. So he wore lots of padding around his body. So they had to create a chair that was wide enough for him to sit in. So we've got the James I chair. As I said, we've got all the personal belongings of the brethren that have lived here, that have come here from wars. We've got pikes from the Civil War, muskets from the Chartist riots. So every period from the 1500s has got some artifact that remains here that we'll put on to display. Oh, and the other wonderful thing that we've had made, which I think is a lot of fun, is we've taken, because a lot of our story revolves around Robert Dudley and Elizabeth I, we've taken a look at the paintings of them together, and we've recreated the costumes that they wore. We've got a wonderful student seamstress that on commission from us recreated a lot of the costumes of Elizabeth and Robert Dudley. So you can see those. Also costumes from the medieval period. Thomas Oaken, who was the master in the 1500s when Robert Dudley acquired the buildings. He was the master that had to hand them over to Robert Dudley. We've got his costume that's been recreated from carvings of Thomas Oaken. So yeah, a lot of fun things.
Sounds like it's going to be a must that people need to come and see when they're at Warwick. And like you've mentioned earlier how Robert Dudley lived at Kenilworth, so that's not far away. So it's perfect. Or you could do Kenilworth, St Mary's, where Robert Dudley is buried, and Lord Leycester Hospital. That would be quite a good combination to do. Yeah. When are you due to open? Do you have an actual opening date yet?
Yeah, we're planning for summer next year, summer 2023, if everything goes according to plan. Okay.
Well, I'm definitely going to be keeping my eye out, because I would love to bring a group to you anyway, as well as me coming and having a nose around. How much of the complex will be open to the public? Obviously, you need space for offices and things like that, but do the public get to see the majority of the site?
Yeah, they do actually. In fact, we're opening up new areas that haven't been opened up before. So we're opening up the chaplain's dining room, where all the new historical interpretation exhibits will be. For the very first time, we're opening up a section of the master's house, the oldest part of the house that was built in the late 1300s. So that's being opened up. And we are actually opening the Warwick wall, the medieval wall outside, that most people really realise that there is a medieval wall. They'll be able to the complex, actually. Don't forget that part of our complex is residential, because we still have the brethren living on site, as they have done since 1571. So there are lots of little cottages and lots of little places where the brethren live that that are private, but you can see the outside, and they're lovely medieval Tudor buildings that you can see.
I noticed in the on your website it says about where there's brethren accommodation now, and it's referred to as it was the Anchor Inn. Is that an inn as in it was a pub, or what was the function of that?
Yeah, the Anchor Inn was just outside the main gates of the Lord Leycester, and it's a lovely, it's a beautiful half-timbered building, built probably, I would say, early 1500s, but it was an Anchor Inn, and it was probably one of those inns that you stopped at on your way from Stratford to London. I like to think William Shakespeare stopped there, but it's a beautiful medieval building, Tudor building. And at some point in time, likely the 1800s, it was acquired by the Lord Leycester and became part of the Lord Leycester complex.
We talked about some of the things you found during the restoration. Obviously, you knew bits were going to be needing to be done. There's always going to be old plumbing and old electrics that are going to need to be addressed. But have you had any challenges that you didn't anticipate or were different to what you'd anticipated?
Well, I'm sure you can imagine that anytime you're trying to do restoration to a 700-year-old building, you're going to come across things that you did not expect. In fact, you expect that you're going to come across things that you don't expect. And it's the usual stuff, though. I mean, it's things like asbestos and rusted pipes and cracked medieval walls that you have to bolster with steam beams. The thing that we don't know as we go further into these works is what will we find that is of archaeological interest, because that's always the big unknown. We're going to be digging in the courtyard, and we have an archaeological watch when that happens. And if you're digging down several layers, it's quite possible that you come across some really interesting finds. And we haven't yet, and that will hold up. That's great. Archaeological finds are really great. They're really fascinating, but not if you're a building contractor, because it means then you've got to hold up the building works while the archaeologists come in with their brushes and they carefully move away the dirt to uncover the find. That hasn't happened yet. That's definitely, as I said, a double-edged sword. Great finds, archaeological finds, fascinating finds. And when building works happen, sometimes you come across Saxon remains and Roman remains. So it's really no joke as to what kind of level of archaeological finds you might uncover. And everything stops as these are properly preserved and looked after, as you would expect. So that's the unknown at the moment. What will we find when we start digging up the courtyard?
Yeah, that will be very exciting. So I would recommend everyone signs up to your newsletter and follows the Lord Leycester on Instagram, because you're sharing things as they happen on there. I mean, it would be almost unusual not to find evidence of an earlier settlement if there's a medieval town.
Yeah, probably. I mean, it stands to reason, actually. I mean, we talked earlier about the medieval wall being built just after the Norman conquest, and so clearly there has been a settlement in Warwick since the time of Ethelfreda, when she came here to fight the Danelaw, protect Mercia against the Danelaw. So we know there's been a medieval or a settlement in Warwick since the 900s and probably before. So almost inevitably, as you dig, you're going to find interesting artifacts from the past. It's almost inevitable. And because this was just inside the wall, the Lord Leycester was just inside the medieval wall, and it was a main thoroughfare for travellers, almost certainly you're going to find things.
Double-edged sword. I mean, we hope and also want you to be on schedule and open up as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
one of the things that I might mention, if I could, is that these capital projects, these major once in a century works of restoration and improvement, they don't come without a lot of support from people. And we have had an extraordinary amount of support from the local community in Warwickshire, Warwick particularly, Kenilworth, Leamington Spa, all the areas around. The local authorities have supported us in an extraordinary way. And so it's really important to note and to remember how much local community support we have, because it's important to the community. The Lord Leycester Hospital has been part of the town of Warwick since the medieval period as the guild buildings. So it's an integral part of the historical fabric. But above that is all the modern funders, the grant and foundations that make this possible. And in particular, we have to be extremely thankful to the National Heritage Lottery Fund, who made a decision that they would support our project. They realised the historical value of the Lord Leycester and gave us a really substantial grant to move forward with our project. So we could not do it without the National Heritage Lottery Fund. So they are a very important grant-making body for us and being successful in our project.
And it's great that it was recognised that your site is one. I mean, it's one of national, international as well. I would suggest importance. That I think you are less well known than you should be. Hopefully, things like this interview and we'll go some way to raising the profile. I think once people know you're there and you're back open, there's going to be a lot of interest. Now, people can get to you fairly easily, actually, by, let's assume most people are going to be coming into London. If they're a tourist, you can get a train directly to Warwick from London. So I would suggest people really think hard and try and get it into their itinerary if they are coming after summer 2023. I am thoroughly looking forward to coming and seeing you. I'm getting a nice sneak preview whilst you're still in the middle of everything, so I will be very careful, and also going to come back when you're open fully, and we'll be telling people more about what I find. So thank you so much for your time today, and we're going to keep an eye on everything. It's just fascinating. It's fascinating, and I can't wait to come and see you.
You're welcome, Philippa. Thanks to you too.